Beauty from the Shelf is a podcast where industry experts fill in the gaps integral to growth for early stage beauty founders and brands. I'm so excited to have Monica Saracino join us on the podcast today to talk about the importance of building a good team. Here's a snippet from our conversation today.
And then you launch. And I would say for most brands, almost all brands, you launch and it doesn't always go exactly the way you thought it would. The KPIs you set need to be reset. You question a lot of things that you've thought about. And sometimes you question everything. And I think that is very typical. It's like a normal thing. And I always encourage founders to stay positive and motivated because it's not uncommon for that to happen.
Now let me tell you a little bit more about Monica. Monica is currently the COO of Janessa Leone, a luxury fashion brand focused on high-quality essentials where sustainability is at the forefront. Monica also consults and advises other beauty and personal care brands from pre-launch through their first 100 million. Prior to joining Janessa Leone, Monica was a founding team member of Beach House Group, a consumer products house that builds global beauty brands, and she also worked at Target, managing multi-million and billion-dollar categories. Monica started her career in management consulting with Deloitte in New York, and she originally hails from Queens, New York. Monica was the perfect person, in my opinion, to have to come onto the show and talk about the importance of building a good team. I know this personally as I worked under Monica when I worked at Target. And as you can see from her background, she has experience working with both large and small teams at big and small companies. Prior to starting the episode, I do want to take a brief moment to thank our sponsor for today, the Emerson Group. Thank you to the Emerson Group for sponsoring this podcast and allowing me to continue to share information to early stage beauty brands to help them on their path to growth from 0 to 20 million. With all that said, let's go ahead and get into the episode. Monica, thank you again for joining me today on the podcast. I'm so excited to have you on. This episode is focused on team, and I know that you've worked on a variety of businesses at a variety of different scales. You've managed teams for beauty, lifestyle businesses, and now a fashion brand, which is awesome. I love it. And I know some of those brands specifically include Beach House Group. They incubated Moral Own Care with Kendall Jenner, Beis with Shay Mitchell, and Pattern, of course, which I'm very familiar with Tracee Ellis Ross. And as you just stated in the intro, you're currently at fashion brand Janessa Leone. So let's talk growth. Do you see themes in growth at different revenue levels?
Yeah, I mean, the retail experience I had as a Target merchant combined with the experiences you just mentioned from Beach House Group, it really has allowed me to see growth at all stages, anywhere from this pre-revenue startup brands to managing billion-dollar brands. And while I think every business is different, there are some common themes I've seen at different levels. And after 2 decades of working on brands, one thing is very clear and certain to me. And that is building and nurturing best-in-class teams is always, always key to growth at all levels. Supporting the team to focus on what matters, prioritizing the work that moves the needle is what drives the growth at all of these levels. And quite honestly, regardless of the size, it's key for leaders to motivate, reward, engage, and inspire the team. And that's where these high-functioning teams will go above and beyond. And they'll accomplish things they didn't even realize they could do. And it's actually magic for brands and growth.
I love that. And I think in so many of these conversations that we have about how to build a brand, obviously there's some foundational pieces of marketing and all of that are part of it. But what you said there, it's like the people are really making the magic happen. I absolutely love that. So how does growth look different if you're growing from 0 to 2 million or 2 to 10 million, 10 to 20, right? Like, does it look a little bit different there? What can brands kind of expect as they are in those pre-launch phases?
Yeah, I mean, especially for those brands in the pre-launch phase, when you're going into it, the founders and the founding team, as they should, they have a vision of how the business will go from 0 to 2 million. who their consumer is, what their cohorts are, how their product fills a consumer need, what creative will resonate, all of those things. And the list goes on around all the planning that we do and the strategizing we do. And then you launch. And I would say for most brands, almost all brands, you launch and it doesn't always go exactly the way you thought it would. The KPIs you set need to be reset. You question a lot of things that you've thought about. And sometimes you question everything. And I think that is very typical. It's like a normal thing. And I always encourage founders to stay positive and motivated because it's not uncommon for that to happen. But the pressure's on, right? Especially if you have these investors. And the first inclination is, okay, let's revisit everything. But at this stage, I would say, and at this stage, it's so critical to work with the team to say, okay, what is meaningful? What meaningful pivots will move the needle? It's not easy to find what that is. And then you're also reforecasting the financials and the budget. But I would say what's different here is that doing this quickly and being more surgical about what areas need to pivot and using both art and science, use your gut, but also just getting back to that and prioritizing because that's what those best-in-class teams need at that time. And then that's where I've seen it difficult for the teams to function in those difficult times. And that happens and we're just learning. And so I'd say prioritizing for the team is always key at those early stages.
Yeah, I definitely can see with what you're saying now why when you see some of the job descriptions at startups, it will say we need someone who's flexible and who's willing to do a little bit of everything.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of pivoting. And I think it's interesting because I'm glad we're talking about teams today because as I said earlier, you hear a lot of talk about teams at big companies, right? They'll talk about how the team made the business, but you don't always hear that at these smaller startups. There's a lot of focus on the founder and their vision and their story as things are getting up and really getting established. But I think part of that is because of what you said, like roles are less defined and many folks need to pitch in where help is needed. So I would think that finding the right person can be kind of a challenge. So I'm curious, have you seen any specific resources or ways that founders, or I'll say questions that founders can ask or ways to assess what type of talent is needed? Are there certain skills? Should they go based on growth, goals? Like how do founders approach and say, this is who I need to hire to build my team?
I think that's a really great question. And I'll start with, as you mentioned in the earlier stages, from a people standpoint, the teams are lean, they're mean, they wear many hats. And it's all hands on deck all the time, and there's maybe not a lot of structure, not a lot of process, budgets are tight, and you just do whatever's needed to get the job done. And, there's a spreadsheet for everything, right? And you're really trying to figure out sort of how these processes develop over time. And I think when we are looking at what type of talent is needed at all stages, it still goes back to those priority settings, right? Like the priorities that you set. What will move the needle and being really honest with yourself about what's needed and what the gaps are. So I would say, especially in those early stages when you need sort of the well-rounded, all-around people, it's looking at all levels. What are the most important traits that matter to you? And that should hold true across anyone that you bring in. I would say, for example, at those early stages, cross-functional horsepower is a big thing because there's a lot involved. You're doing lots of things, you're solving lots of different problems. And so, when I was working at Beach House Group, for example, hiring and retaining the right people, when you have a brand incubator, creating multiple brands at the same time was the name of the game. And during those early days, when we hired the first, call it 30 people, the founders and I agreed that we had a good sense for the characteristics we needed for the people that came through the door. The energy level, the horsepower, and the ability to work cross-functionally. And quite honestly, those people do exist. They aren't easy to find, but it is really important to, in my experience, to start at higher level. And I think that could be hard for the budget, but I do think that it's that, director and above level that really understands and has had opportunity to see how teams work cross-functionally and be able to function in that way as well. A lot of the questions that some of the founders ask, and it's like, are they willing to take out the hypothetical garbage, right? Like, are you willing to roll up your sleeves and do what it takes? And I have a really person named David Weissman. He's really great human being. Started a company called Humankind. He said this before and really believes in it, and I love it. He says, focus on grit. And he's right. Those who are self-starters, those who can persevere, those who have a bias for action, who can problem solve, those people you can rely on and trust. I would say that works for all levels, but I love that idea of grit as well.
That's really good. That cross-functional horsepower, I haven't heard that before, but that's a really salient point for me because you're right. Once you get to a certain level, you've seen what it's like to work across the different functions. And so it allows you to have more visibility and knowledge about how they might interact together. So thank you for sharing that. I think on that point, sometimes you need someone who's a full-time employee, and sometimes you kind of just need someone for a moment, or maybe someone who's fractional. And so how should brands assess what type of external hire they need in terms of, is this a contractor? Are you full-time with benefits? I mean, and not that we're going to get into like that side of things, but help to answer that question.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've found to be most effective is that short and long-term business plan. And, we talked a little bit about in those early stages of pre-launch, you build your plan. But what's really important after you're sort of in it is understanding, obviously, the strengths and opportunities of the brand and revisiting that 3 to 5 year outlook. It's so important. And that 3 to 5 year outlook is not just about a sales goal, but it's about people and process and technology. But we're talking about people here. And so why that's so important is because in that 3 to 5 year outlook, now you've gotten a good sense for what your strengths and opportunities are, where you can double down. And then it helps you look at what the building blocks are. Setting the number is one thing, but what are the building blocks over the years that will get you there? Quantifying them. And of course, understanding revenue and profitability, but truly knowing what the building blocks are forces you to think about what specialization is needed. It forces you to look at potentially what the gaps are. And so it's hard because you have a team who's done it all. But there does come that difficult moment in time when you're looking at, as you said, the either consultants or full-time where specialization increases. And so as you're looking at those building blocks, you're thinking about exactly what it is you need. You talk to mentors, you talk to other brands, but you really have a surgical approach to growth. And of course you can pivot, but these are big priorities where you can understand what's needed. And that's where I'm looking at, in the earlier stages, sometimes you're not exactly sure. You know that you need to have a head of growth, but what does that mean? What do they need to be really good at? And so sometimes those are the times when you're looking at those consultants or those part-time people where you're sort of piloting a concept where you're not exactly sure what traits they have to have because it's a little bit of a different business. And these consultants in particular can help you determine those things. They can also help you determine what you don't need. And that's a really important thing to look at because often you get in and you think, this is what I want. And as you get into this new channel or this new project or this new area of growth, you learn a lot. And sometimes it's great, especially when you're on a tight budget, to use those consultants. Now, of course, the best consultants act like they're in the business, right? They're there, they're full-time, they're in it with you. And those are the greatest people to find to help you understand what it is that you need and don't need. And if you're lucky, they're the ones that you might bring on full-time. But I do think that if you know exactly what you need and you have the budget for it, you go into that piece full time. But a lot of times agencies and consultants really do help you develop a view and a better view of exactly what you need and how. And ultimately, hiring and retaining the right people is the name of the game, right? So every hire, especially in these early stages, is so meaningful. And I think that's why it's really important to, if you are unsure, utilize other resources so you can really get exactly what it is your business needs long term.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So just thinking about, okay, so you're building your team, you're trying to build your brand. As you said, you have investors on the hook potentially. There's a lot at stake, right? Like the pressure to succeed is very high. And I think there's a lot of pressure on those founders, especially like I see it so much. And I'm going to talk about it in depth in another episode. But there's just a lot of pressure on founders to make sure they're kind of picking these right people and doing all of these things. And it's also important, as you said earlier, to keep the team motivated. So what are some things that founders can do to help keep those teams motivated? And then next question is, what can the founders do for themselves to stay motivated? So it's like motivate the team and keep themselves going.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really important piece. And what I would say is what founders need to do, because it's really difficult, right? You're looking in a lot of different places, but as you're thinking about the team, be very aware. Pay close attention to the team. Listening is really important. Striving to understand where everyone is. And that might be spoken or that might be unspoken. At the end of the day, you can't motivate the team if you don't know what motivates them. And that is really important. And, we learned a lot of that at Target, Monique. I think, engaging and inspiring was a huge part of the culture. Motivating teams was a critical piece of what you and I as leaders at Target needed to do as we were running close to $1 billion businesses. So whether you are a $1 billion business or not, this motivation piece is critical, and making sure that you're paying close attention and you're very intentional about it. And I think you can lose sight of that easily when things get really busy. That has happened. But thinking about their growth, their development, and how they're doing, and just simply asking those questions, having the conversation goes a really long way. And I think you're right. Founders too themselves need to be motivated. And I think, part of what I do as an operator that have worked with founders or been on founding teams is I tell these founders and work with founders to make sure that they keep themselves surrounded by the right leadership team, the right board members, the right advisors, the right investors, the right peer group. And, sometimes you look at a resume and you think they're the right ones. But if you really look at all of it, on paper, they could be. But it's that connection, it's that ability to support you as a founder, and your team, your leadership team can support you too. And that's where it's like when you're hiring those people that are right by your side, that's something that I would ask founders to look for. I think with all the founders I've worked with, I try to make it a point to be aware of what it is they need. I try to understand what it is that motivates them as well, because at the end of the day, being a founder is so rewarding, but it can be really exhausting. And it's important that they surround themselves with the people, not only that they trust, that can do the job, but also that can support them when they need that support and motivation, so that the founders continue to motivate other team members, because it's really critical. And people lead teams very differently, but that's one important piece of the pie, that these best-in-class teams, as I said in the beginning, they make the world of difference. And so I think that the founders too need that kind of support.
That's really good. And I think even what you're saying in terms of the founders making sure who they're supported by, like I hadn't thought of that before, but that's like monitoring your energy, right? Like, who is around me, and are they positive? Are they thinking abundantly? I mean, I always say like a founder has to be somewhat of a dreamer, because especially in beauty. Like you're coming into a super competitive area, business area, but you are coming in to do something that hopefully, right, has never been done before. And so there has to be a little bit of dreamer and that energy. You got to protect that to make sure that no one is like tearing you down or stopping you from doing something, right?
I love that because I always say like the founders should be dreamers. They should be completely unleashed. And I know that can be hard on the teams, but it's the leadership team to protect that piece because that's where the magic comes from, right? Yes, there could be a lot of priorities, too many things. That's okay. That's what the leadership team should be there to do. And founders should trust the leadership team to say, like, let's pick a few things and do them really, really well. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't have been able to build something from 0 to 100 or grow any of these brands or companies without some of these founders really thinking completely differently, really being visionaries. That's how Janessa is. That's how the leaders at Beach House Group have been. That's how we have really created these strong consumer brands. It's because the vision that these founders have for, as you said, being dreamers and completely unleashing. And then it's our job as operators to take that and to make that a reality and then making sure we're focused on all of the right things. And so I love what you said.
Yeah, and I love that. It's like founders should be unleashed. That's a bite-sized piece. That's good. That's good. Last question here. So you've worked with a lot of founders and a lot of leaders, and I'm sure that people lead differently. They have different styles, different ways of doing things. But I'm curious, have you noticed any salient themes with some of the leaders that you have seen? Things that you're like, this is something that's always present, or this is something that definitely helps as you're leading a team?
Yeah, I think I've had pretty amazing leaders in, the last couple of decades. And a lot of them as well. And it all comes down to some of the things. And I think I've said those things because they've taught me those things. And it really is that the team is of top importance to the leader. And they know that the success of the brand really lies with the team that comes with them. So that's number one. I would say number two is another word that you heard a few times, which is prioritization. And I think what's important there is when things get really busy, leaders are the ones that have experienced what not to focus on, what things won't move the needle. And that's a really important thing to help team members do. And at all levels. Even today, I may work with VPs who are fantastic with a lot of experience. But over time, I've learned that the list of 10 things you have, I could probably pick 2 or 3 that you need to focus the most on, that will give us the most value, that will get you motivated and excited because you're going deep, that'll get you pumped because you'll see all the results that come through all of your hard work. And then it's those leaders that recognize and reward. I think that's important. And recognition, as you know, it comes in many different forms, and it all comes back to having a lot of empathy and knowing the people on your team. I would say at the first 30 people at Beach House Group, I learned them very intimately so I could understand what it is they needed, what it is that motivated them, what kind of rewards and recognition inspired them when they needed support without saying it. So I think the best leaders that I've worked with have taught me to do that.
I love that. I mean, Monica, I'll say, I know you were a phenomenal leader when I was at Target. And so I know
Thank you.
Anyone who has worked with you has definitely seen a lot of the things that we talked about in this episode in your leadership. So you certainly model that. And I'm grateful for you coming on here and sharing your wisdom with other people. Thank you again to Monica for joining me on the podcast today. It's very often that I hear big companies talk about the importance of team, and I felt that it was crucial for us to talk about how that looks a little bit different for early stage beauty founders and brands. As always, if you found this podcast helpful, I encourage you to share it with a friend or a colleague, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.